there is a way of knowing what direction human history is going and how it will come to an end. Some have had lots of theories about this. Maybe history is on a cycle, it's repeating with the rising and falling of empires. But we know that the hand of God is sovereignly guiding all of history, and He is bringing everything to a particular end. Now, S. Lewis Johnson was going through this, and he once remarked that as he looked at Daniel chapter 7, he could spend several weeks in this chapter, and that would barely scratch the surface. He would not be able to plumb the depths of this chapter. And I am planning to spend a few weeks here myself. But remember, as we look at this, the goal here of Scripture, the goal of prophecy, as we have been talking about for the past couple of weeks, is not to confuse us, but rather to give us clarity, to give us understanding, to comfort us as we understand that God is indeed in control and His plans are going to come to fruition. Now, the book of Daniel is taking a turn here. There's a shift of focus because before this, in the first 6 chapters, we've been talking about history, and Daniel's been talking in the third person. Here, we are shifting to a more prophetic focus. In fact, many commentators look at this chapter and they consider this to be the most important chapter of Daniel. This chapter, much like chapter 2, lists the coming history of the world, but it does so in, as one commentary notes, in the visions both of the first and second advents of the Lord. And much more detail is provided concerning the 4 kingdoms, particularly the final phase of the 4th. And so there is so much more being shown here of Gentile history, of the coming of the Roman Empire. And there is a gap of time that is implied as well. So there's a lot more that we see here in this chapter than we saw in chapter 2. Now, since Babylon took over Jerusalem, the Jews, of course, as you may remember, and as we've talked about, the Jews have not been in control of their land, and they are not in complete control of their land even today. The nation has been oppressed. Rome kicked them out. It wasn't until the horrors of Hitler's Holocaust were known that the nations agreed that it was time for the Jews to have their own homeland. And yet, who agreed? It was the nations who agreed. And the Jews had to abide by the stipulations that were provided there. To this day, there remains a permanent Gentile presence in Jerusalem. And the Jews do not even have full control over the Temple Mount. This is still what is known as the time of the Gentiles, or the times of the Gentiles. And it will continue until the end, until Romans 11 is completed, where we read about the fullness of the Gentiles coming in. That is what Daniel chapter 7 is talking about. Now, it is interesting also that this chapter is in Aramaic, the language of the Gentiles at the time. And it resumes Hebrew in the next chapter. So this is a chapter that is also meant to be read by the nations. This is something that has been given here. And as we consider this, we are also considering something that will lead us into the book of Revelation and will give us some insight into passages like Revelation chapter 13. But as we consider this, let's focus on these 4 beasts here. And we will see that there is first a divine overview of history. As we consider that and consider what this divine overview may be telling us, then we can then begin to discuss who each of these four beasts are. And to give you somewhat of a spoiler, I do believe it is the same as we see in Daniel chapter 2. So if you remember the beasts of Daniel 2, these are going, or excuse me, the phases of world history in Daniel 2, these beasts are going to align with that. But before we identify them, let's consider the overview that the Lord gives us, the divine overview of history, verses 1 through 3. Let's take a look at that again. In the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel saw a dream and visions in his mind as he lay in his bed, and he wrote the dream down and related the following summary of it. Daniel said, I was looking in my vision by night, and behold, the four winds of heaven were stirred up by the great sea, or stirring up the great sea. And four great beasts were coming up from the sea, different from one another. Well, we're going back in time a little bit if you think about it. Because Daniel dates this vision back to the first year of Belshazzar's reign. Well, that places us backward chronologically before the events of chapter 5. And so we have backtracked quite a bit. This is well before Daniel's experience in the lion's den that we just read about in chapter 6. Daniel himself would have been younger, a spry young man in his 60s at that point, rather than an older man. And Babylon still appears to be strong on the surface, although, unbeknownst to Belshazzar, the Medo-Persian Empire is arising on the horizon. Now, Daniel receives this revelation at that time, and he writes it down, and he's going to put all of his prophecies, all of his apocalyptic literature, as some people call it, in the second half of this book. And he describes this revelation as a dream, although he also describes visions. And that is interesting to see that he's using both terms. Is it a dream or is it visions? And the best understanding, perhaps, is that he's using the singular term dream here. And he is saying that that dream, which is a unified dream that he was having, contained many scenes. And that is a series of visions, the successive scenes that unfolded before him. Now, 5 times in this chapter, Daniel says, I was looking, and once he says, I kept looking. This means that these aren't momentary flashes, like he just has this flash of a beast in his mind, and then it's gone, and he's like, what was that? No, he is having this dream, and this dream is continuing on, and as it's continuing on, he is seeing these beasts come up one after the other, and he is seeing that they are all connected. And he is able to continue to look at them and evaluate them, because this is God who is giving this. Now, when Daniel wakes up, what does he do? He immediately writes it down because he sees that there is something significant to this. This is not just a dream that perhaps might have signified a bad burrito or whatever the Babylonian equivalent was at that time, right? This was something that had come from God. And in fact, as we see that it troubled him, it is very much like Nebuchadnezzar's visions, because you remember that Nebuchadnezzar was also troubled greatly by the visions and dreams that he was receiving from God. He writes it down, not just so he can remember it, because I'm sure that he would have remembered it regardless of writing it down, because that is the nature of God's prophecy. He also is writing it down mainly for God's people, mainly for the Jews who are going to be living in Gentile times, and for all of God's people, so that we will all understand. It's also written down for the nations, so that the nations will understand. And he uses the term summary here, which means literally the head of the words or the chief matters. He's writing down the salient points here that need to be communicated. That means that he may have seen a lot more than what he is telling us, but he is giving us the main parts of the vision that we need to know right here. He is recording the substance so that it may be preserved, studied, and understood by the Jews and by the people of God. Now, in verse 2, he begins to move us into that vision. And he introduces the scene. He says, I was looking in my vision by night, and behold, the four winds of heaven were stirring up the great sea. Daniel shifts to the first person again, as I said before, and he's going to be doing this throughout these visions. And this one opens up in the night. And that's perhaps fitting for the kind of dramatic imagery and content that he presents for us here. He says first the four winds were coming down from heaven. This would be the first heaven, the sky, where the wind blows, right? These are the winds. And why are there four of them blowing? Well, they are blowing perhaps as representing the whole world, perhaps the 4 points of a compass, north, south, east, and west. And so there is perhaps an intersection of winds. If you think of how 4 winds might come together, there is an intersection there, which is creating a churning of the waters. What are winds? Well, in Scripture, winds can be indicative of spiritual forces that are at work in human history, such as God's providential activity through angels. And later on, we are going to see that angels are, in fact, behind a lot of what we see in human history. That is one of the ways that God works. But here we see the winds almost as though they're in competition, and the nations are being stirred up as a result. Now, that is what's being symbolized here with the winds churning up the Great Sea. Now, the Great Sea, what could that be? Well, that could be the Mediterranean. But that really isn't what the point here is, because the sea symbolizes restlessness, chaos, and it often does in Scripture. And it also represents peoples and nations. You say, wait a minute, why would it represent chaos and people? Have you met people? There is a lot of chaos, and that can be out there with people. Just go to any retail store and you will see that. Isaiah says, the wicked are like the tossing sea, for it cannot be quiet. Isaiah 57:20. And so the sea becomes a symbol of people who are constantly being disquieted. And Daniel's giving us a picture of nations in turmoil, of human society that's been agitated. Of course, I'm speaking in the passive. Agitated by what? Perhaps by the wind, perhaps by angels. So there may be something happening behind the scenes, but this is going to lead to conflict and unrest. Well, verse 3 then explains the result. Out of the chaos of humanity arise 4 great beasts, 4 kingdoms. That's what happens with conflict. Sometimes there do arise powers, superpowers, you might say. Of course, I mean that as a geopolitical thing, not as a comic book thing. I see Jorge smiling back there, so I had to specify that. As in America is a superpower, but I'm not saying necessarily that America is one of the beasts here. Daniel is explicitly told that these beasts, though, do represent kings. And that's in verse 17. So these are kings that are rising up. Now, they are rising from the same sea. But note that they are different from one another. They arise from the same sea, but they are different from one another. And that means that they're not only different from the first one or the second one, they are each unique in different ways. They have their own character. They have their own method of domination. They each have their own place in God's sovereign plan. And again, most commentators agree that these beasts correspond to the phases of the statue in Daniel chapter 2. And so this is representing the same progression of history. These four beasts represent the same progression of history that the other, or that the statue is demonstrating. So that means that Daniel is not necessarily seeing the four beasts all at once. He's considering a beast, and then he sees the next one rise up, and then the next one, and then the next one. Now, before we look at the beasts individually, again, I want to remind you that, again, this was written in Aramaic, the language of the people, the lingua franca. This was the language that the world did business in. God wanted the people to know that he knew how history was going to happen, and he is foretelling it before it happened. Now, this is written before Persia comes along. This is written while Babylon is still on top. God is saying, I know what's about to happen, because he is one who decrees the end from the beginning. This should cause us to glorify God. This should cause people who don't know God to stop and say, wait a minute, how is this possible? This, again, is why Daniel is one of the most hated books by some liberal theologians and scholars. And they're trying desperately to make this square peg fit in a round hole by saying that it must have been written after the fact, even though the evidence indicates that it was written before the rise of these nations. They don't want to admit that this is genuine prophecy and that it is being fulfilled on the world stage. And when you go to your secular public high schools and you're learning world history, you're learning the exact same history that God prophesied in Holy Scripture. You are learning his story. Hopefully that's not too lame, but that is something to keep in mind. It is his story. It is his story. So as we think about that, let's consider each of these beasts, and we will consider the lion of Babylon. Verse 4, the first was like a lion and had the wings of an eagle. I kept looking until its wings were plucked, and it was lifted up from the ground and made to stand on 2 feet like a man. A human mind also was given to it. Now, this is the first beast, and it resembles a lion, which is the king of beasts, and then it has wings, which of course is the wings of an eagle, which is of course the king of the birds. Now, this tells us that it would be powerful and it would be fast, and it would be able to move around very quickly. Now, the symbolism is unmistakable because not only was Babylon swift and powerful and majestic and terrifying in its conquests, it also used this very image in its own artwork. And you can see in some of the architecture of Babylon that's been dug up by archaeologists, this very image etched on its bricks. This is something that was used to symbolize Babylon. And so this is very, very clear in history. Scripture, of course, is using this to not only symbolize Babylon, but Nebuchadnezzar himself, who was both a lion and an eagle. And again, this is part and parcel with Babylonian art. Now, Daniel's attention is drawn not only to the beast's appearance and power, but also its humiliation, because he watches as its wings were plucked. Now, if we're thinking of Babylon as a nation, we might say, okay, Babylon is being humiliated. But then what does it mean that it's being made to stand up on its own 2 feet? This is perhaps a better image of Nebuchadnezzar. Because again, this is talking about kings. And so Nebuchadnezzar was humiliated. When was that? Well, we read about that, right? We read about him losing his mind. And that was something that God had orchestrated toward the end of his life. And he was humiliated. His wings were plucked, as it were. And he actually went down onto all fours like a beast. And it wasn't until after God gave him grace and then restored to him the mind of a man, because remember, the mind of a man was taken from him and he was given the heart of a beast. It was then that the heart of the beast was removed and he was returned the mind of a man. It was at that point that he returned to his own 2 feet and stood up like a man. So this is talking about Nebuchadnezzar. This is exactly paralleling his life here. And so he was proud, and then he was humbled, and then he was set back up once again. And of course, his mighty empire was restrained. We read about that in chapter 4, and how he was made to eat grass like an animal until finally his human mind was restored to him. Now, this points to God's sovereignty over kings. And all of these kings, all these beasts that we see, God is over all of them. If he is over the first, he is over all of them. And there's not one of them that arise outside of God's control, and there is not one of them that can do anything without God's permission. This empire that was once ruled with beastly ferocity was made to recognize its humanity and its dependence upon God. And this lesson is clear. Even the mightiest empires are subject to the hand of God. And that's important. That's why in Daniel 2 we see Babylon and Nebuchadnezzar himself as representative of the head of the statue. God is over Babylon. He is over all the nations. And that is true of the next nation, which comes up next. And that's what we're going to be looking at here next. The bear of Persia. Verse 5. And behold, another beast, a second one, resembling a bear. And it was raised up on one side, and 3 ribs were in its mouth between its teeth. And thus they said to it, Arise, devour much meat. Now this bear is a fitting image for the Medo-Persian Empire. And that is the best image here. Some think that perhaps this is just the Median Empire, and the next beast is the Persian Empire. But the Median Empire did not conquer the Babylonian Empire. It was the Medo-Persian Empire, after it had come together, that conquered the Babylonian Empire. And it's powerful, but it is also lumbering. But that doesn't make it any less ferocious. And it can destroy. Unlike the lion, the bear does not emphasize majesty or speed, but it does have a lot of brute strength. And that is what we see with the Persians, a lot of brute strength. And of course, we see it raised up on one side. Perhaps this is some kind of imbalance. Some thought maybe this is it getting ready to charge. But rather, this is more of it being raised up on one side, perhaps speaking of the fact that in the Medo-Persian Empire, the Persians are going to be more powerful than the Medes. The Persians rise to dominance in this empire. Daniel 8 confirms this interpretation when the Medo-Persian Empire is also portrayed as a ram with 2 horns, but one horn is higher than the other. And so this works best for this picture. So you might say, what is in the bear's mouth then? Because some have said, well, maybe these are tusks or fangs. And of course, that would give it a very terrifying look. But mostly it's translated as ribs. And there's perhaps none of us who don't enjoy a few good ribs in our mouths. But what is being pictured here? Well, obviously it's a beast that has just devoured some animal, and there is a remainder of that animal in its mouth. But there might be something significant to the fact that there are specifically three of them. And the Medo Persian Empire did have three major conquests: Lydia, Babylon, and Egypt. And so that may very well be what's being pictured here. But the command is, from heaven is not yet finished with it just conquering. We have it said here, arise and devour much meat. This is something that God has commanded. Perhaps this is a command, it says just they here, perhaps the winds, perhaps the angels are kind of directing things behind the scenes. But this is, of course, all within God's sovereign plan. And history confirms that Persia ruled over more territory than any empire before that. Now, once again, the dominion that the Persian Empire had, the Medo-Persian Empire had, was not something it gained independently. This was a power, a dominion that was granted by God. Even this ruthless expansion unfolds under divine permission. This, again, is going to be so important as we are looking at each of these and as we are considering each of these and as we may be living under oppressive governments or the like. We need to remember that God is ultimately in control. We may wonder why God allows certain things to happen, but sometimes it is part of God's bigger plan, and we must trust that. We must trust that He is calling up each of these beasts and He is allowing them each to arise. First, the lion with wings. Second, the bear. And third, we see the leopard of Greece. The leopard of Greece. Verse 6. After this I kept looking, and behold, another one. That would be another beast, like a leopard. Note the simile with all this. Like a leopard, resembling a bear, like a lion. This is he is not saying that they are these animals. They are like them. He continues, which had on its back 4 wings of a bird. The beast also had 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. Now, what do we have here? Well, we have a very fast animal. This is much like the animal that scientists have been trying to create out of a cheetah and a crab. I don't know if you've heard about that. They had to stop because things went sideways really fast. Sorry. Well, that's not quite what we have here. We have a leopard. And leopards are similarly pretty quick, right? They are fast animals. They are known for agility as well. And the 4 wings definitely would add to that. This beast represents the Greek Empire, specifically under Alexander the Great. Now, Alexander the Great, he is named, not Alexander the mediocre, right? He is Alexander the Great because of his rapid conquest and his expansion of the Grecian Empire. It was astonishing what he accomplished. In less than a decade, he had subdued the entire Medo-Persian Empire and pushed eastward all the way to the borders of India. It was amazing what he had accomplished as a young man. In fact, it's even said that he wept because, as he said, there were no more lands to conquer. He wanted to conquer more. Well, the 4 heads here signify the division of Alexander's empire after his sudden death at the age of 33. Remember, he died unexpectedly. His generals eventually carved out the kingdom from the four major regions of the kingdom that would have included, of course, Macedonia, the Thrace and Asia Minor, Syria, and Egypt. What began as a unified empire quickly fractured. And that's going to be something that we are going to revisit. So keep that in mind. The Grecian Empire broke into four pieces, and that will come up later. So you might want to note that because that will be on the test later on. Now, once more, Daniel emphasizes that dominion was given to it. The speed that Alexander the Great accomplished, or with which he accomplished his dominion, was something that God allowed, God granted. It is interesting that he never, even though he conquered in a way the land of Israel, as far as I know, historically, no one actually died from that conquering. And that is, again, part of God's providence. God supernaturally is directing these things. And the speed, the brilliance, the reach of the Grecian Empire was not because Alexander, as a man, was so great. He was, at the end of the day, still a man. How is it that he accomplished what he accomplished? This was by the will of God. It is also interesting to me to consider that whereas the world before that, in that region, spoke Aramaic, in a lot of that region, the rest of the world into Europe and into Asia Minor and all of that didn't all speak Aramaic. When Alexander the Great comes through and he conquers that entire region, he Hellenizes it. He makes it all Greek. And they all begin to speak Koine Greek. And by the time the New Testament rolls around, and the apostles are told to go forth and to spread the gospel from Jerusalem into Samaria and into the uttermost parts of the world, they are going into Greek-speaking areas. And they can bring copies of the Greek scriptures. And anywhere they go, they get to speak to people in the same language. Isn't that interesting that God just so worked it out that way? I think God had a plan in all of that. This is all unfolding according to God's sovereign decree. And that is true of this final beast as well. Let's look finally at the terrorizers of Rome. The terrorizers of Rome. And I say that plural for a reason. Let's take a look at this, because there is a beast that arises here. Verse 7. I kept looking in the night visions. So he's not waking up and having a different vision. He is still in his dream considering this, and he's looking, and behold, a fourth beast, dreadful and terrifying and extremely strong. Note that he doesn't say that it is like anything. There is nothing that it is like, perhaps. And it had large iron teeth. It devoured and crushed and trampled down the remainder with its feet. And it was different from all the beasts that were before it. And it had 10 horns. While I was contemplating the horns, behold, another horn, a little one, came up among them. And 3 of the first horns were pulled out by the roots before it. Behold, the horn possessed eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth uttering great boasts. Oof. This is a terrifying image. It's dreadful. As this beast is going forth, it is pouncing perhaps on its prey, crushing, and then biting and devouring with iron teeth. So there is nothing that is able to withstand its teeth. And whatever is left, it then begins to trample down until it is stamped out all life beneath it. Now, this is, especially with the iron teeth, a recall to the iron legs of the statue that Daniel 2 talks about. And this, again, unmistakably identifies this kingdom with Rome. This is Rome's. And Rome's power was unparalleled. This was the greatest military on earth. It did not merely conquer, it crushed. It crushed. Whatever remained, again, after its initial assault, it trampled underfoot. Think about how it popularized crucifixion. That is just one of the horrific punishments that it engaged in to keep people under the thumb of Rome. The empire's strength, organization, and longevity surpassed all that came before it. This is a terror. And it grew horns. Now, horns often are a symbol of power, and it grew 10 of them, we see. What might this represent? Well, this represents perhaps 10 kingdoms that are associated with the final phase of Gentile dominion. Now, it is interesting as we think about the statue, it had its iron legs, and then it came down into feet, and of course feet have 10 toes, and here we see this beast that has 10 horns. And so there's obviously some kind of parallel that the Lord is trying to draw between these images. And again, it does seem to be that the beast, it then transforms into something that has 10 kingdoms. Now, we don't know exactly what that is at this moment. But we do know this, that Rome was never conquered. We've talked about that. Rome was never conquered. It just kind of waned in influence and then began to fracture and balkanize. Could it then be restored one day? Yes. Could the power, or could the areas that have been influenced by it, and remember, there are still Roman ruins that we find everywhere, all over Europe, right? There are ruins everywhere. We can find evidences of Rome. Some of the roads that Rome laid are still in use today. And the culture that exists in Europe is marked indelibly by Roman culture. You say, what about America? Well, America coming from Europe has also this influence. Just look at our dollar bills, look at our signage, our historical etchings on some of our monuments. You can see the influences of Rome right there, as well as the influences of these other kingdoms, by the way. And so, yes, we're all part of this great Gentile dominion. Now, Rome has fractured, as I said, but even so, Scripture anticipates a future revival of this empire that is not yet unfolded. Now, what is that going to look like? Some thought maybe this could have been the League of Nations. Of course, the League of Nations is no more. Some thought maybe this could be the European Union. And that's possible that you might see something arise from the European Union. But whatever this is, it hasn't quite come to fruition. And there will be a time where we will see a dominion that arises with 10 kings, with 10 nations, and it will become something very much like a revived Roman Empire. When that happens, Daniel says that he is looking at these horns and he notices another horn that comes up. A little horn. Now, he's a little horn. And perhaps there's a little bit of sarcasm with that because The horn that is uttering great boasts, he's just a little horn, right? He's just a little horn. There may be some mockery that is with Daniel there to try to humble this arrogant and blasphemous person that's being represented here. But the truth is, he is not going to be insignificant on the world stage. And so we see with these 10 kings, 3 of them perhaps will come into conflict with the little horn. And we will see that these 3 horns are completely torn out by the root. Now, of course, when we see deer and other animals with horns, sometimes we see that they shed their horns, right? But this indicates something that's more violent, something that's being torn out by the roots. The implication is that the little horn actually does this, and it exercises dominion. This is a picture of the Antichrist. There's no way around it because there's nothing in history that parallels what we're seeing here. Some say, well, what about Antiochus Epiphanes? He does not fulfill all of what we see here. I'm not saying that he's not a type of the Antichrist, but this is going to be the Antichrist. And this is still yet on the future stage. This is still something that will happen. You say, well, what? How do you think it's going to happen literally? Look at the other beasts. Look at the other beasts, right? They happen literally. What did we talk about last time? We need to be consistent. And so if all of that happened literally and it's coming about and we see that, then what do we see here? We are anticipating the rise of 10 kings, and we are going to see a little one, perhaps one that was insignificant at one point that we didn't suspect, that comes to power. Sometimes I've seen some Christians who are dispensational get into the guessing game. Well, who do you think the Antichrist is? Well, do you think it's going to be Putin? Do you think it's going to be Gorbachev? I guess not many people say Gorbachev these days. Not many people even know who he is anymore. But there have been lots of guesses throughout the years. Okay, is it this person? Is it this person? If it's someone you've heard of, that's probably not who it is. It's going to be someone who comes up that is largely unknown, and he just comes up onto the world stage, and he comes to power. And he will attempt to remake the world in defiance of God. Ultimately, that's what we're going to see. Now, history has seen echoes of such arrogance before. But Daniel is pointing us toward this final, climatic expression of human rebellion. A ruler who will embody the beastly nature of Gentile dominion in its fullest form. This will be the beast. And is that not a name that is given to the Antichrist? This is coming. And it's going to lead finally to that point when Christ returns and he establishes his kingdom, his reign, his dominion. This passage shows us human history. And it shows us that apart from God's restraining grace, human history is brutal. Empires can rise from chaos, dominate through violence, and then be dominated by someone even more brutal. But the message of this chapter is not to despair. It's to see that God is in control and sovereign over all of this. Every beast rises by God's permission. Every kingdom falls by his decree. And the chaos of history is moving inexorably toward the kingdom that will never be destroyed. That's the kingdom that we'll consider next. Daniel will lift up his eyes from these beasts, and he will look to the throne of heaven and see the coming of the Son of Man. But for now, we're reminded that while these beasts roar and devour, the Lord still sits enthroned. And I hope that you are confident with that no matter what you read in the news and no matter what you see going on out there, God is still on the throne and things are happening according to his sovereign plan. We can trust him.